Hi everyone, my name is Tahira Smith. I am a health systems management major, and I also double major in communication studies with a focus in public advocacy. I also serve as a civic engagement coordinator for the 49er Democracy Experience Office, as well as serve as Secretary of Business Affairs for the Student Government Association. So I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. Regardless of your political affiliation, I think we can all agree that this has been a long, stressful election season. In fact, the results from Stress America survey conducted by the American Psychological Association indicate that 68% of all adults surveyed say the upcoming election is a significant source of stress right now. These are unprecedented times that we're facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So changes to the process in North Carolina have been extremely stressful for many voters. Many of us just voted for the first time in our presidential election. Some statistics for you guys is in North Carolina, voters aged 18 to 29 already make up about 93% of their total turnout in the 2016 general election during the early voting period. With North Carolina being a key battleground state in the presidential election, Gen Z and millennial voters accounted for 28% of the state's total 4.5 million votes during the early voting period. There is certain uncertainty that we are facing right now, and we're unsure of what happens next. This is the first of many events to help us through the uncertainty over the next few days. Please see and visit democracyexperience.uncc.edu for more information.
So hello everyone, my name is Shanice Ford and I'm a computer science international studies double major with a minor in Chinese. I am also the student director for civic engagement and democracy over the SERVE team in the Department of Leadership and Community Engagement. So here to talk us through what, how, and the next steps is Dr. Eric Heberlig. So Dr. Heberlig is a professor of political science and public administration at UNC Charlotte. He is also co-author of Congressional Parties, Institutional Ambition, and the Financing of Majority Control, winner of the 2014 D.B. Hardman Prize for the Best Book of the U.S. Congress, American Cities and the Politics of Party Conventions, How Government Got in Your Backyard, American Labor Unions in the Electoral Arena, Classics in Congressional Politics, and numerous articles on the politics of Congress, interest groups, elections, and campaign finance. He served as a Congressional Fellow of the American Political Science Association in the 105th Congress. He is co-chair of the university's programming for the 2012 Democratic National Convention and the 2020 Republican National Convention. After Dr. Heberlig's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Please put your questions in the chat.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give a few brief remarks to set the context and update the status of where we are in the election. But I really want to focus on answering your questions. So please do go to the chat and enter them in, and they'll forward the questions to me. So where are we now? Well, we're in a little different position than last night, perhaps when you went to bed, although not a whole lot different. Right now, Joe Biden is ahead in Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin. This morning, the state of Michigan shifted over to Biden. They're still counting votes there. And other undecided states, Donald Trump is ahead in North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and the 2nd District of Maine. So what that means is if Joe Biden wins the states where he's ahead, plus the one single vote from the 2nd District of Nebraska, which has already been projected for him, Biden will win exactly 270 electoral votes, which is the minimum number necessary to be elected president. So often in like my intro class or my presidency class, when we play around with the Electoral College map, students like to see what combination of states they can make to get exactly 270 Electoral College votes. And I kind of poo-poo that. I said, yeah, the chance of that happening is really small. You know, there's no point in doing that. Well, okay, so joke's on me. Here we are. We might have one that's exactly at 270. Please note that the numbers out this morning and for the next couple of days are really just projections. The states are counting votes, but they then go through a process of auditing the ballots to make sure that they're accurate, and then they certify the results. That often takes a week or two. So at that point, the results become official. All the results we have now are unofficial results. North Carolina, for example, is not called yet due to the fact that we have a number of absentee ballot requests that have not been returned. Those absentee ballot requests are larger than the current margin between President Trump and Joe Biden. Our deadline for receiving absentee ballots, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day, is November 12th, so 9 days from the election. Now, that could change the result of the election, obviously, which is why they're waiting to call North Carolina. But Biden would probably need to win more than 2/3 of those votes in order to surpass Donald Trump, and we'd need to have almost all of those votes or absentee ballots submitted. So it's probably a pretty big stretch for Biden to overcome those margins. Where we might see changes is in some of the statewide races or maybe state legislative races that are much closer. For example, the Attorney General's race is about 10,000 votes difference between the Democratic Attorney General and his challenger. So what I'd urge you at this point is just be patient. Things are really working the way they should. In every state, trained nonpartisan officials are counting the ballots. There are representatives from both the Democratic and Republican parties there to oversee everything, to make sure the process is conducted without fraud or bias. So it's taking longer than usual. One, because it's close, but two, as you're well aware, there's been a pandemic that's affected just about everything, including how we vote. So a number of states shifted much more heavily to mail-in ballots than they typically do. North Carolina was one of those. But the difference is North Carolina has a robust process of early voting. So we're used to counting those type of votes early and have the election vote counting infrastructure prepared to do it. And our state law allows the Board of Elections to start to process those votes early. Whereas in a number of the states that we're still waiting on, in particular Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, those states do not have a history or infrastructure of lots of mail-in votes, and their state law prevents the Board of Elections from doing anything to process those ballots prior to Election Day. So those Board of Elections are basically playing catch-up. That means they have to open the ballots, they have to check the requirements, such as signature requirements or witness requirements, to make sure they're all legal. They're not just counting the votes. So the reason it's taking a long time is the Board of Elections are doing what they're legally required to do to prevent fraud, to make sure it's one person, one vote, and the people who are voting are legally allowed to vote. So the point of that is that some votes are always counted after Election Day, particularly in states like North Carolina that allow absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day to be counted for a certain number of days after they come in. So you're probably aware of the president's statements and tweets about needing to decide the election based on the votes that were counted last night. He's allowed to tweet whatever he wants, and as I'm sure you're aware, he tweets whatever is on his mind. Sometimes he does it to generate media coverage or to try to shape public opinion, but that's his emotional release and as a means of your entertainment. His statement regarding which votes should be allowed to count and not really don't have any legal basis. Elections are conducted by state governments. They have their legal process for counting votes, which they do every year, and that's what they're following. North Carolina, in particular, had a divided result this election. Democratic Governor Cooper was reelected, yet in the federal races, President Trump and Senator Tillis appear to have won reelection. Council of State and judges, we got some Democratic and Republican winners on both sides. Many of those results were very, very close. In the state legislature, Democrats look like they'll pick up one House in the Senate, but lose 4 in the House. So what we've seen in North Carolina in this election, similar to what we've seen in the past few and what we're seeing in other states, is a very dramatic urban-rural divide. The urban areas increasingly shifting Democratic, rural areas increasingly shifting Republican. The suburbs were thought to be the swing areas in this election, and of course they were, but they don't appear to have shifted as strongly for the Democrats in 2020 in North Carolina as much as they did in 2018. So, as was said at the outset, we're in a period of uncertainty. The uncertainty will work itself out over time. We just need to be patient, trust in the process, and let things work out. My advice is to minimize your social media use. My guess is that your social media feeds are filled with lots of angst and outrageous statements. Some of them may be true, many of them may not be, but always check for reliable sources of information, which is why I'm glad you've come today, because that's what I hope to be able to provide you. So I'm happy to turn it over to questions that are coming in through the chat.
So I think, Dr. Heberly, we're going to take questions that we have comprised first, and then we'll get to the chat after. So the first question that we've comprised, many of us might not remember the election of 2000. How is this election similar to or different from the uncertainty created after that election night in 2000?
So the 2000 election was the Al Gore versus George W. Bush election, which I suspect is before most of you were born. So you may remember discussions of that election by the hanging Chad election. The vote was so close in the state of Florida, it ended up being about 500 votes out of millions cast that separated George W. Bush and Al Gore. But there was a long process of counting and recounting the ballots, figuring out what to do with ballots that were mismarked and damaged in some way. There were ballots that were made out of punch cards that were not completely punched through, and voting officials had to, eyeball them to try to figure out whether it was punched all the way through, and if so, whether the vote counted. So we had to wait for about a month until that election was finally settled. I think the key difference between 2000 and 2020 is that in 2000, the results really hinged on that one single state, Florida, and a number of very odd circumstances. This year, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll wait that long. Even the longest estimates from, say, Pennsylvania on when their votes will be counted is Friday. That doesn't mean there will be some a few absentee ballots in those states that will still need to be counted, but I think we'll have a pretty good idea in a few days. I think the other difference this time around is that we're dealing with multiple states that are still up in the air. So it creates more uncertainty because there are multiple paths for each candidate to get to 270 votes. So that kind of multiplies our unease about the situation that's going on. But already there's the states that have votes available have been counting them pretty quickly this morning. So, I suspect we'll know pretty soon, what the most likely result's going to be.
Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to everyone sending questions in the chat box. Our next question is, the vote count seemed to be mostly shifting towards the Democrats this morning. Why is that?
Because that's where most of the votes are in urban areas. And when you have a shift to mail votes where they don't have the infrastructure and capacity to count them in a hurry, that's where you're going to have the backlogs. So they're counting votes in largely Democratic areas, and that's why you're seeing the Democrats pick up votes. That's not unusual, actually. If you look at states with experience in mail ballots, many Democrats tend to vote a lot by mail. So often we see the shift after Election Day go towards the Democrats.
Thank you. Our next question is, the pre-election public opinion polls seem to be off, just as they were in 2016. Why have they been wrong?
That's the key question that a lot of us are going to be struggling with. The polling industry is going to have to make some major decisions. The way most of us excused the results in 2016 was evidence from the exit poll that the voters who made up their minds in the last week shifted heavily for Donald Trump. And the polls that were taken of the key swing states mostly stopped before the last week. So those shifts were not picked up on by the polls. The national polls in 2016 ended up being pretty close, but they were pretty significantly off in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So this time around, the poll showed few voters were undecided. It showed Joe Biden was much more popular than Hillary Clinton was. We had much more polling all through last week, especially focused on those 3 states, and we didn't see late shifts. So this is much more troubling that the results were off in similar ways that they were in 2016. Now, having said that, they don't appear to be off in all states, but the same states they were off on in 2016, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, were much closer. Georgia appears to be close this time, but looked like it was close last time and wasn't. Florida was much more Trump than the polls indicated. So my speculation is that there are probably working class voters in those type of Rust Belt and southern states that just haven't been participating in polls. And it would help explain why we see both this bump in 2016 and 2020, yet the poll or approval ratings and kind of the horse race between Trump and Biden have been very steady throughout much of Trump's presidency. They just haven't been participating in polls generally. So pollsters really haven't had the data to fix the polls to make up for those people who aren't participating. But I'm sure that's going to be a huge effort to figure out what's going on. And the other reason I think we were surprised they were off was because the polls really weren't off in the 2018 midterm election. So my guess is that there are people who are turning out to vote for Trump in 2016 and 2020 who are not regular voters, who distrust the system generally and are attracted to Trump's anti-establishment message, who don't participate in polls because they associate them with the media or other institutions that they don't trust, and therefore we're not correctly assessing their points of view in our polls.
Thank you. So our next question is, did voter turnout increase or decrease because of the COVID pandemic? And how did turnout make a difference in the election results?
It looks like turnout's going to be way up, similar to what we saw in early voting. Early voting was consistently up. The projection I found this morning was that 160 million people will have voted, which is about 10 million higher than most of the projections. That's about 66.9% of the eligible population. If that turns out to be accurate, that's the highest voting turnout percentage-wise we've seen since 1900. So before 18-year-olds and women got the right to vote. So that would be astounding. How it made a difference is unclear. I think the best guess at this point is that you had high turnout on both sides, which essentially canceled one another out. You had high turnout from rural, less educated whites on behalf of Donald Trump. They usually don't vote in the numbers they apparently did. Likewise, you had high turnout of minorities and young voters who are irregular voters turning out to vote for Biden. If everybody turns out, well, you get huge turnout, but if those two groups of irregular voters are voting in different ways, they offset one another and we get big turnout and still a tie.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it seems like we've got a ton of questions coming through. So just in the essence of time, I guess we're going to go ahead and shift to taking some questions from the gallery. So it looks like we have Debbie sent in a question or perhaps a comment stating, I have a question that people can vote more than once using the absentee ballot and the many extra mail-in ballots and voting in person. What measures are in place, if any, to ensure each person gets one vote only? I've heard that there is no validation of the signatures or witnesses.
They do have a process that the Board of Elections checked votes. So if you've voted on election day, your absentee ballot or mail-in vote is canceled out. Okay, so no, they have ways of checking that you don't vote twice. Likewise, they do have scanning of the signatures that is matched against the scan of the signatures that are on file. And the computer algorithm figures out if it's close enough and the ballot is rejected if it's not close enough. In North Carolina and many other states, if your ballot is rejected for that reason, you are notified and you get a chance to correct it, or if there's some other error that's correctable. But it has to be done within that time period before they certify the vote. So that's why there's an advantage in turning in those votes early, so that processing by the Board of Elections can take place. And if your vote is rejected, that you have the ability to fix it before the deadline.
Thank you. So the next question coming up is wanting to know more about the judge ruling about the USPS and its failure to deliver some mail-in ballots. This person read that the USPS has rejected to abide by the judge's ruling. Is it legal for the judge to rule in on USPS operation? And if yes, how is it okay for USPS to reject abiding by that ruling?
The ruling yesterday, well, let's take a step back. Throughout the weekend, there was a district judge overseeing this case that basically required the U.S. Postal Service to continually report back on their percentage of ballots that they were delivering to the Board of Elections office, and was particularly concerned that the post office's success rate was lower in competitive states than in non-competitive states, and basically increasingly put the screws on the post office through yesterday to get those ballots in. So yesterday the judge ordered the post office to make a full sweep of their facilities by 3 p.m., collect all the ballots they had, and deliver them to the Board of Elections directly in those states, since a number of those states required mail-in ballots to be physically present in the Board of Elections by 5 p.m. So my interpretation of that is that the courts and the Postal Service did what they could to make sure that the ballots were in on time.
Thank you. Next question is from Adam. What would you attribute to some of the differences between the recent polls and vote results, especially in Florida and Pennsylvania? Do you know why governor and lieutenant governor don't run on a ticket in North Carolina, where they do in some other states?
Yeah, so the lieutenant governor and governor, that's set by state law. The state of North Carolina and some other states have decided to let voters vote on them separately rather than on a single ticket. Other states put them on a single ticket. So North Carolina could pass a new law to change that. The differences in the polls and the election outcome in Pennsylvania and Florida, I think it's because you have a number of hard to reach voters. Probably in Pennsylvania, it's working class white voters. In Florida, it's probably more Hispanic voters and African American voters, and some white working class voters, particularly in northern Florida, that are just A, hard to reach, and B, not terribly engaged in politics, so are not interested in picking up the phone or returning the call when pollsters participate, yet, or when pollsters contact them, yet were energized by Trump's anti-establishment message, so showed up in 2016 and 2020 to vote, even though lots of people like them were not measured accurately ahead of time by the polls.
Thank you. So our next gallery question is there anything we can do to prevent our nation from becoming less united during the uncertainties of the voting outcome?
We are in an uncertain and divided period. I would advise you to listen more than talk. When you get information that you're skeptical of, be skeptical, check it out, try to find whether it's accurate or not. Be willing to raise that question with friends or relatives who bring you information that seems questionable. Ask them if they've checked it out, rather than accusing them of feeding you fake news or biased information. Ask questions. If they're expressing political beliefs or reacting to the election in a way that you find to be inconsistent with your preferences, talk about it. Try to find constructive ways of talking about it. Don't go into the conversation, I think, with a way of convincing them that they're wrong, but more treat it as listening to what they have to say and trying to understand why they think what they do, and kind of providing your perspective on things, the different information that you have, and try to have a civil conversation about it.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Angel. How do they check for fraud in signatures?
They have a computer program that they scan all the signatures. When you register to vote, you sign. So that's the signature that's on file. When you submit your absentee ballot, you sign. So they scan both of those signatures and match them up against each other, and the computer figures out whether it's close enough. They can also do visual inspections for ones that are in question, where the employee, the Board of Elections, along with a Democratic and Republican representative, can visually inspect those signatures and kind of make the call on whether it's close enough.
Thank you. So the next question is, when do the nonpartisan election officials cast their own votes?
I do not know. I presume they can vote whenever they want to. I presume most of them vote early by absentee, since on election day they'd be pretty busy.
That makes sense. So our next question is from Dick. Can you go over the process of calling a race? I noticed many races were being called when relatively small percentage of votes were in. What goes into that process / decision to call a race?
So it's based on a mix of voting history, exit polls, and the actual vote count. For most states that they're called, well, really all states that they're calling very early, it's based on their voting history. So we know that New York and California are going to be solidly Democratic states. We know that Idaho is going to be a solidly Republican state. We don't have to wait around for them to count up all the votes in order to predict that. For states that are more competitive, like North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania, again, we know that ahead of time based on their voting history. So they're going to wait longer to see what the exit polls from those states look like. They're going to wait until we start to see votes tallies coming in, the local board of elections counting them up. Likewise, they're going to wait to see where those votes are coming from to make sure that there's a balance in Republican leading counties and Democratic counties before they make those calls.
Thank you. So next up we have, are there legal issues that Trump can pursue if he loses a given state by a small margin?
Well, first, he'd have to follow the process in the state. The state may allow for a recount. There would have to be some specific problems with votes with specific votes perhaps being cast incorrectly, that the votes would be challenged, and the state would go through its process for challenging votes, I think, before he'd be able to have a firm legal case that he'd be able to get through the courts. Now, having said that, there are lots of things they could challenge and take to the courts that wouldn't be viewed by the courts as having much merit until the state went through its process of evaluating the votes, and there'd be disagreement between the Board of Elections and the Republican and Democratic vote monitors over the status of those votes.
Interesting. Next question from Elena. Do we know if outstanding mail-in ballots in North Carolina aren't folks who changed their mind and voted in person instead of sending in their ballot?
So the ones that are currently outstanding would not be listed out as outstanding by the Board of Elections if they voted in person yesterday. Because as I talked about in an earlier response, those are all lined up. So I've seen different estimates for what the number of absentee ballot requests that haven't been turned in. The Board of Elections number is lower than what I've seen in other media reports. I suspect that's because the Board of Elections has accounted for those voters who requested absentees, yet voted early or voted in person, so is canceling out their absentee ballot requests, where the media is largely just counting the total number of requests ahead of time.
Thank you. So this next question kind of stems off the last one. Is it possible that the results of any of the North Carolina Legislative, Council of State, and judicial races will be affected significantly by the remaining absentee mail-in ballots?
Yes. I think the most likely Council of State race to be affected is the Attorney General's race. There's only about 10,000 votes that are separating those candidates. Most of the other close statewide races are Council of State races are about 100,000 vote difference, similar to the presidential race. So they're a bit less likely. There are a number of statewide judges races that are very, very close. So I think the Attorney Generals and some of those judges races are where the remaining absentee ballots could make a difference.
Thank you. So next question from Mark Sanders. Mecklenburg Board of Elections website is reporting 100% of the precincts have reported and 71% of the ballots cast have been cast. So that's 565,000 out of 792,000. So does that mean that there are roughly 226,000 ballots to be counted that have been received, or that there are that many potential absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, that may be received, but some may not have been sent, ?
Yeah, both the State Board of Elections website and the county websites have 100% precincts reporting. Usually that includes the early vote and absentee as well. So I think what those other numbers are referring to is the proportion of votes cast versus the total number who are registered to vote, which of course people can choose not to vote. So I think the votes that we're waiting on at this point are the people who have requested absentee ballots, whose votes could dribble in the mail over the next few days. So while we're on the topic, I kept a close eye on the number of absentee ballots that were coming in over the last several days of the election, and it was about 10,000 ballots each day. So we might continue on that trend for the next few days, but after that, I would think it would start to taper off pretty rapidly. So my guess is the maximum number of votes that would be coming in late through the mail would be 50,000 votes.
Thank you. Do you think we'll be in a situation where there'll be recounts? What is the basis for asking for a recount?
The recount rules vary state by state. In North Carolina, I think I'd expect a recount more for some of these close judges' races, maybe some of the state legislative races, probably unlikely for the presidential race. Recounts may shift votes by a small amount. Often in statewide races, it's 100, maybe 200 votes, but clearly not enough to make a difference in the presidential race, unless the absentee ballots come in big numbers and are disproportionately favoring Biden.
Okay, so our next question, I think you kind of addressed a bit, and saying that if Trump does call for fraud, that it's based on the state's legislation and how they want to handle the legal aspect of that. But if there's anything else that you wanted to touch on as far as whether or not Trump can call fraud.
Well, he's been calling fraud for weeks and months. So this is part of his messaging about the election to energize his supporters. So it's not, as I said earlier, it's not really a legal argument that he's making at this point, though, of course, once the ballot counting process plays out, there may be legal issues with some ballots that would merit evaluation by the courts. But at this point, yesterday the voting process nationally seemed to go much more smoothly than many people expected. We're not hearing of significant complaints about any mishaps in how the votes were cast yesterday. So I'm much more confident than I thought I might be that we can get through this process without significant legal wrangling.
Thank you. So our next question, if you feel comfortable and if you have to make a prediction, what would it be?
About the outcome of the presidential race, I assume is what they're asking. I think given the trends in Wisconsin and Michigan, Biden is likely to take those states, which puts us at 270 electoral college votes. I think that the gap in Pennsylvania and Georgia are pretty significant. It's not impossible that Biden overcomes them, but I think it's not terribly likely. So my guess at this point is that Biden has 270 electoral college votes, and we're left with a very divided outcome.
Thank you for sharing that. Next question, what happens to the votes if the USPS reported them as untraceable?
Well, if the votes aren't turned in by the state's deadline, they're not counted, regardless of whether there's a good or bad reason for them not being submitted on time. So if it's the post office's fault, well, it's the post office's fault, but the vote doesn't get counted.
Thank you. Next up, we have, why was the Electoral College put into place, and is it really a fair way to elect a president when it often overrides the majority vote?
The Electoral College was put into place because that's the way the founders wanted the president to be elected. Having said that, it does not work today at all the way the founders intended it to work. The founders did not want ordinary people like you and me electing the president. They thought we didn't have enough information to do that. They thought we would be easily manipulated by politicians telling us what we wanted to hear and by offering us goodies, or by, well, they didn't anticipate television commercials, but, advertising and messages that would be, manipulative, and that we would fall for it. The founders fundamentally thought that we were self-interested and wouldn't be able to put the public good ahead of our own self-interest, and politicians would take advantage of that to gain power for their own self-interest. So they wanted the Electoral College to be electors who they thought would be chosen by the people or by the state legislators, to be local leaders like mayors, city council people, former government officials who would have experience in governing, and thus who would know what it took to be an effective president, people with political experience who perhaps would have served in Congress with the main candidates, and thus would be able to evaluate their character better than we can evaluate them based on television commercials or watching debates. So the electors would really be casting informed votes for the presidency. They wanted those electors to be independent, to make up their own mind. They could certainly attempt to persuade one another, but the electors would be more fully informed than the public, so they wouldn't really be following public opinion. The type of presidential campaigns that we see today, with candidates traveling around, speaking for themselves, having rallies, doing commercials, that's all really an early 20th century phenomenon. So it's relatively recent in our history that we do elections this way. And the winner-take-all allocation of Electoral College votes by the states, that actually started happening early on once political parties were formed. But the founders didn't want political parties because they thought that political parties would put the interest of the political party ahead of the interest of the nation. And they wanted to promote multiple constitutional structures that would allow for deliberation and persuasion for people to kind of figure out what the national good was, rather than having knee-jerk party or political or ideological reactions to questions of public policy.
Thank you. That was such a good answer. Okay, so next question. What is the best nonpartisan source for information and results?
I think most of the professional mainstream media are good sources. They have fact checkers. Their professional ethos is to check it out. Don't just accept rumors and hearsay. Having said that, there are media outlets that their business model is to target particular ideological groups. So they're going to shape their news coverage in ways that they think will be well received by the audience that they're targeting. So MSNBC targets liberals, Fox News targets conservatives, just about any other TV network or newspaper. Well, their editorial pages are certainly biased, but the way they cover the news, they typically try to be as objective as they can be in how they present the news. And when they mess up, we'll correct it, which social media, of course, does not.
Thank you. So next up, we have another question about the Electoral College. What is the likelihood of moving away from the Electoral College into a national popular vote?
Almost none. Back in the dim ages, when I first started teaching prior to the 2000 election, I used to say that at various times throughout our history, the Electoral College has produced a winner of the presidency that did not have a majority of the votes from the public. And then when that happens next, the public will be surprised, they'll be outraged, and we'll get rid of the Electoral College. And then that happened in the year 2000, and nobody cared. And I said, well, it's because we were obsessed by the hanging chads in Florida. People didn't focus on the Electoral College. And then it happened again in 2016, and I wouldn't say that nobody cared, but again, there wasn't really a major effort to overturn it. Now, certainly there are groups that try to do this. There's a lot of advocacy on it, but the main barrier to that happening is it would require a constitutional amendment. And the main reason that people want to change the Electoral College is because it keeps producing outcomes where the winner of the popular vote does not win the majority of the Electoral College. That result occurs when you have a very close election where states that have fewer numbers of people in their populations have a little bit more than their share of Electoral College votes because of the 2 Electoral College votes that represent the Senate. So small, less populated states get a boost in the Electoral College relative to their share of the population. So the example I use in class is that Wyoming has enough population for half a congressional district, yet the Constitution guarantees them a whole person representing them in the House, and 2 senators. So they get 3 Electoral College votes when their population should entitle them to half an Electoral College vote. So if you do the numbers in North Carolina, it takes, I think, 3.5 votes to equal 1 vote from a person in Wyoming. So I'm sure people in Wyoming are perfectly decent people, perfectly virtuous, but the Electoral College counts them as 3.5 times more virtuous than you are. I'm not sure how that's fair, but that's the way it is. So to get rid of the Electoral College vote, you'd have to convince the Senate, which overrepresents those small states, to get rid of the Electoral College by a 2/3 vote. And then you'd have to get 3/4 of the states, which would be even more dependent on those small states, to undercut their small increment of power in the Electoral College by changing it. So not likely.
Okay. Next question. Wisconsin and Michigan are within 25 to 30K votes. With the continuing counts, could any shifts occur?
Sure. Yeah, they're still very close. I don't think there's many votes left outstanding in Wisconsin. There are still a few, or I think a decent number in Michigan. But in both, well, in Michigan, the votes that are, the largest number of votes that have yet to be counted are from the more populated counties. So Wayne County, which is Detroit, and the suburban counties outside, which are the main source of Democratic votes. So I think any additional votes in Michigan are likely to pad Biden's small lead there rather than flip it back to Trump. And Pennsylvania is a little bit more of a mixed situation. Most of the votes that haven't been counted yet there are from the big urban states, or the big urban counties, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But counties there decided what order to count votes in on their own, and you do have some of the rural Republican counties who hadn't counted their mail votes fully yet. So Pennsylvania, you're more likely to see some offsetting Republican votes for Trump.
Thank you. Our next question is, why don't more people vote early?
I think it's mostly tradition. They're used to voting on election day. They like the process of being able to vote with their neighbors. And most of us are creatures of habit. So once we do something and it works for us, we keep doing it. In fact, even when it doesn't work for us, most of us keep doing it.
Thank you. So Trump has already said that he's won despite not all the ballots being counted. I think you covered this a little bit, but if there was anything else you wanted to add to if Biden were to win the election and Trump refused to step down, what could be done?
Well, the Constitution requires that the Electoral College votes from the states are counted by the House of Representatives when the House meets at the beginning of January. So those votes will be counted, and the Electoral College vote will be made official by the House. If Donald Trump chains himself to the Oval Office, whenever the inauguration day is, Joe Biden will take the oath of office. And at that point, the Secret Service will tell Mr. Trump, you are trespassing in the Oval Office, and will remove him. I don't anticipate it coming to that, however.
So we have another question about news sources. And are there any particular news sources that are more reliable than others for updates on election results?
I've been following on Politico and CNN. State Board of Elections websites are where they get their information from. So if you want to go directly to them, I'd recommend doing that. But the major news sources aggregate all that information for you. They may not aggregate them at exactly the same pacing, but they're not going to be far off.
Great, thank you. This is actually a really good question. I'm curious as well. Why are early votes counted as absentee even though they are made in person?
It's just a labeling issue. In North Carolina, traditionally they've counted the in-person early votes first, and then the election day votes, and then absentee ballots, because they're typically a very small number, they count them last since they're not likely to affect the outcome. This year, because mail-in votes were a much more significant proportion of the total vote, and because they were allowed to process the votes early, they know people want the results quickly, so they process those votes, had them ready to be counted along with the early votes. The beginning of election day, processed them, so in the evening, when the precincts reported back their results, they could run the election day in-person results and give us the total aggregate count in each county.
Thank you. So our next question, voters in North Carolina clearly chose Governor Cooper, but are leaning towards Trump. What do you attribute to the difference in choices considering their vastly different viewpoints and platforms?
Voters often don't vote based on policy. In both cases, they're the incumbent. Typically, that's a significant advantage. That gives them name recognition and typically greater fundraising capacity to influence voters who aren't paying very close attention to politics. Many voters, particularly when you have very high levels of turnout, are people who aren't terribly interested in politics. So they're going to vote for the name they know or the person they know a little bit about. which tends to be the incumbent.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. In a presidential election as close and contentious as this one, do you believe it's still an appropriate practice for states to call the election without 100% of the votes counted?
Well, it's not states that are calling the election, it's the media that's calling the election. And what they're doing is doing it based on, you know, their experience with how the voting trends work in these states. And the reason they do that is because they're, you know, competing for viewers and readers, and we keep tuning in to see what the projections and the results are. If we were more patient than we are, I think they'd be perfectly happy to wait and allow all the votes to be counted and then give us predictions. But we're typically not very patient.
Thank you. Our next question is, what happens if Trump and his more extreme supporters don't accept the results in the scenario that Biden wins?
Well, I don't know what it means to not accept. You know, they can, you know, if either side, you know, if Biden loses and Democrats don't accept the election, you know, they can sit in growls, you know, until the next election and then go out to vote and try to get their friends out to vote. What I think the person is probably asking is not accepting it by protesting or engaging in violent activities. And certainly there are concerns that would happen. You know, certainly people have the right to protest. You know, what I would urge people who are listening to do is, if you feel compelled to protest, is to be aware of your environment if you go down there. Keep an eye out for potential violence. Get away from sources of potential violence. Kind of plan an exit route when you get there, to figure out how you can make a safe exit. And the other thing I'd say is that that violence usually creates a backlash against those who are protesting, even if it wasn't the planners of the protests who are causing the violence. So it's often not a way that you're going to persuade the persuadable public that you have the moral high ground.
Okay, so our next question is there a future where more states operate like Nebraska and Maine, where they divide up electors by congressional districts?
Yeah, so should more states follow the district plan? The fact that only 2 states do it should be a pretty good indicator that most states don't want to do it. So most states' legislators would say, I want the candidate from my political party to get as many votes as they can if they win. So there's that incentive to keep it winner take all. The other incentive to keep it winner take all, particularly if your state is competitive like North Carolina, is, say, Virginia and North Carolina have similar population sizes, similar demographics, similar economies. So all else equal, candidates have equal incentive to campaign in both states. But we decide to allocate our electoral college votes on the district plan rather than winner take all, and Virginia stays with winner take all. Okay, so if I'm a candidate, I see I can get 15 electoral college votes by winning Virginia, and I see that by going to North Carolina, well, the districts are pretty solid for one candidate or another. I might be able to get, you know, one more vote by campaigning heavily in a swing congressional district in North Carolina. Well, the math there is pretty easy. I'm going to go where I can get 15 electoral college votes to Virginia rather than going where I can get 1 electoral college vote in North Carolina. So they're going to spend less money here. They're going to spend less time meeting with voters and addressing their priorities. As a state legislator, I want the candidates to come to my state to help me solve my voters' problems. So I want to give them the incentive of more votes to come here and do that.
Thank you. So to be considered on time, we're going to take one more question and then go ahead and adjourn. So unfortunately, because of the two-party system, other party candidates, Libertarian, Green, etc., are unlikely to win races. What do you think the motivation for running for office of those candidates is? And since they know that they are unlikely to win?
Third-party candidates run because they feel strongly that the two parties, neither of the two parties are representing their views effectively, and they want to give voters who think like them a choice. Essentially, they're running as an opportunity for a protest vote against two candidates that you dislike from the major parties. The upside of that is that when third parties do attract quite a few votes, the major parties want those votes, so they adjust. They try to figure out what agenda that third party candidate was offering that was popular with a set of voters, and they will often incorporate that issue or that particular stance into their agenda in order to try to steal back some of those votes. So third parties and third party candidates can have an influence even if they never win.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Heberleig. So that concludes our time for today, and I'm going to go ahead and adjourn this meeting. Thank you everyone for attending.